Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Trish Takamoto, and I'd like to welcome you to the Yale Career Panel on A Candid View of Journalism and Publishing. This panel is the 28th in the Career Panel series, and along with our fireside chats, which were conceived by Peter Young, class of '74, it's a way to help Yale students and alumni to make more informed decisions about their careers. Peter was supposed to be our moderator for today, but unfortunately he had to go out of town on business. So I'm going to be filling in, and our stellar panelists, I'm sure, will make me be brilliant. As for my background, I'm class of '76, and I was photo editor of the Yale Daily News. I'm currently on the board of the New York chapter of the Association of Asian American Yale Alumni, which is one of the sponsors of this series. And we'd like to thank all of our sponsors, but in particular, we'd like to thank the Yale Alumni Association of New York, Becky Brooks of the New York City chapter of the SOM Alumni Association, and Steve Blum, Wiley Chang, and especially Henry Kwan of AYA. We're recording this session, so in a few days it will be posted on yalecareerpanels.com. So if you'd like to see any of our previous career panels or fireside chats, you can go there and see all the different careers that we've covered so far. Our panelists today are Betsy Sullivan, who's streaming from Cleveland. And here in New York City is Chloe Zhang on my right and Jim Dow on my left. And we're just pleased to have all of you participate in this panel. And first, I think we'll just go and have each of you talk about your careers and where, very briefly give you your career path up until now. So Chloe, if you'd like to start.
Sure. Thank you for having me. My name is Chloe Sang. I was Yale class of 2017, so recently graduated this past May. I was in Timothy Dwight College, and while I was at school, did an a cappella group, was the station manager of the Yale radio station, and contributed a couple of pieces to the YDN while I was freelancing during my senior year for an outside newspaper as well. So currently I work as the executive assistant to the senior vice president of worldwide news gathering at NBC News, which is a mouthful. And my role there is very wide ranging. It has been a mix of having the flexibility to do my own things, so pitching to digital, writing articles for NBCnews.com, assisting with various large-scale projects. For example, when Megyn Kelly went and interviewed President Vladimir Putin last month, I was sort of on the editorial team doing research for that. And a plethora of other things. I started at NBC in September, so it was my first job out of college, and I had begun my tenure there as a news associate, which is a program that NBC does for people who are specifically interested in becoming field producers and people who are interested in the industry. Started on the breaking news desk there, and then eventually found my way into this role in January. And prior to that, most of my experience had been in print and digital. So I worked as a freelancer for Metro, which is a newspaper that circulates in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia, writing both for their print pieces, for their print editions as well as their online, and doing mostly music, pop culture, lifestyle pieces. And I also worked as a revenue strategy intern for Vox. So I was doing branded content for them. So all of my work has sort of been in this industry, and this is now my first real foray into breaking news and journalism.
First real job.
Yes.
Okay, Jim.
Well, I'm Jim Dow. I'm the op-ed editor at the New York Times, class of '79, which makes me, when I say it, feel even older than I am.
Bite your tongue.
We can talk about this more later. I did not actually do any journalism at Yale. And when I graduated, I worked at a place in New York called the New York Chinatown History Project. And did that for several years before I decided I would try my hand at journalism. And I worked at a small paper in New Jersey, worked at a bigger paper in New Jersey, went to the New York Daily News for a couple of years, and then from there came to the Times. a long time ago. And at the times I've kind of been a journeyman. I've done a little bit of everything. I covered, I started on the Metro desk like most people do. I became an Albany correspondent and the Albany bureau chief. I went to Washington, covered Congress, covered the 2000 presidential campaign, State Department, the Pentagon, eventually became a national correspondent, was the deputy Metro editor for a few years, went back to being a national correspondent covering military issues and affairs, then became the deputy national editor, and for the last 2 years, the op-ed editor. So
Different jobs, yes.
Yes.
Betsy?
So I will date myself even more than you, Jim. I'm class of 74, the great class of 74, JE, and then I also got a master's degree from Yale in Russian and East European Studies, actually. It was known then Soviet and East European Studies. So this actually was very advantageous to me. I am a third generation journalist. Both my parents were journalists. They met covering the Civil War in China. And my father worked for the New York Times for 50 years. So I'm actually quite a bit out of the norm of this era in that I've worked in Cleveland for nearly 40 years. So typically you move quite a bit in journalism, but I haven't had that, had to do that. There was a big debate in my family when I graduated from Yale College about whether I would go to Columbia Journalism School, where my mother went, or do the master's degree. My father advocated that. He said it was sort of a new era of journalism where you needed expertise to get reporting jobs, and so I followed his advice. It proved advantageous because I came into the journalism market just as Watergate was breaking and everybody wanted to be a journalist. The first job I applied to was an International Affairs Monthly. 300 people applied to be a file clerk. And within a few weeks, I had talked my way into a reporting position at the same rate of pay. So not very much money, but in those days you could live in New York City for not very much money. That paper went out of business. I came to the Cleveland Plain Dealer. I've basically been in Cleveland ever since then. And kind of, as Jim described, did virtually every kind of reporting job you can imagine before I ended up in the opinion arena, which kind of was circuitous because I was able to be the paper's European correspondent, foreign correspondent. I covered the breakup of the Soviet Union, the wars in the former Yugoslavia, the disruptions in Eastern Europe as those countries achieved independence, traveled around the world twice in opposite directions on various reporting endeavors. A wonderful career. I started writing a foreign affairs column when I became a mother so that I wouldn't have to travel quite so much, and kind of found myself drifting into the opinion realm at that point. I applied for a job on the editorial board, and I've basically been on the editorial board for, wow, probably almost 20 years. I've directed the editorial board of the Plain Dealer since 2009, and since 2016, when we created a digital spinoff company, I went over with a staff that's remarkably similar to the one I started out with, very young, very innovative, trying new things online, a lot of social media. We Facebook Live our endorsement interviews, for instance. So lots of fun. We have the candidates' retinues out there live tweeting off of our Facebook Live. It's quite a bit of fun. But of course, the business has changed quite a bit. And I remember when I first started at the Plain Dealer, noticing some of the older employees would sleep at their desk. I thought, wow, what a great profession. You get so old, you could just, it's not like that anymore. You really have to work. I'm sure that my two colleagues there will attest to the fact it's a nonstop effort to keep trying new things and keep pushing the envelope so that we remain relevant and important as we must be.
And actually, that's a good lead-in to our first topic, which is where is the profession heading, good and bad? I mean, I'm sure technology has definitely impacted the newspaper business a lot, and not just in the reporting, but also the financially. So do you have, Betsy, would you like to start on that?
Right. I mean, I read with great interest and sadness the package of pieces that came out of Denver this week that I'm sure you all have seen, essentially in some ways writing an obituary for media metro, newspapers. It was, kind of a unprecedented cri de coeur from the staff of the newspaper that has seen their numbers diminish and does not want to see Denver lose its last major metro paper. This is the real problem, and I see this from Cleveland, is that while I think we can argue that papers like the Times and the Washington Post, because of their stature, their importance, will find a way. It's increasingly difficult from a financial standpoint for mid-market papers in regional markets. Cleveland had the deepest penetration, that is, the largest number of people subscribing to the paper of any newspaper in the country after Milwaukee.
Wow.
Before the Great Recession hit, and then they kind of amplified by the challenges of the Googles and Facebooks of the world. And one of our, I didn't play a role in this decision, but one of our cost-cutting moves was to cut back home delivery to 4 days a week. That's really eroded our circulation. I think that maybe, we'll see whether that was a good move. I think there was sort of this thought that, print is going out of fashion. My son, for instance, gets all of his news off Reddit and BBC Online and so on and so forth. I personally think there will always be a place for print. I hope that, my neighbors think I'm crazy. I get 7 newspapers delivered at the end of my driveway every morning because I truly believe that print has to survive for newspapers to survive and the news websites that are affiliated with them. But, just in terms of that's the bad, that we don't really have a business model, and digital advertising isn't quite making up it's not making up where we were. And we just, you have to have the money to have that robust reporting to face up to resistant government. Big news organizations have large legal bills. And, that is part of the reality of the private media. On the good side, I think this is actually a time for, innovative people to get into the business. There's sort of an entrepreneurial path that you can follow. There's always going to be, I hope, a market for solid news reporting that's based on facts and not an ideology. And that is so important that we continue. I think most people who go into journalism have a part of them that wants to contribute to the public dialogue and make sure that it doesn't get hijacked by these, sites that are just echo chambers. So that's the good side. There's opportunity there as well.
And Jim, how about for the New York Times as a big market newspaper?
Well, and the Times really is no longer really, we don't consider ourselves just a New York City paper. I mean, the Times is surviving largely because years ago it went national and opened up bureaus around the country and started circulating and publishing and printing around the country. And now we're very much global. We have Spanish language edition, we have a Chinese language edition, we have a very large presence in London. And so we're banking on the growth of our subscriber base worldwide, really. But I do just want to sort of second what Elizabeth was saying about, smaller metro dailies, which are in trouble everywhere. And I'm so glad that the Plain Dealer is still working. I have a good friend, David Shribman, at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and that paper is in deep trouble as well. These are all really fine papers that are struggling, and I think that is easily the worst trend in the newspaper. Really, the journalism business today is the decline and real weakness of these papers, because they are so important to holding local government accountable and providing sort of crucial public service to, just about every major city in the country, really. The Washington Post is, thanks to Jeff Bezos, is a very healthy operation. The New York Times, because we're a global operation, is healthy for now. The LA Times is not so healthy, and there really are very few other major papers that are doing well. So, not to depress all our young would-be journalists about the fate of newspapers, is Betsy, it's Betsy, right?
Betsy, yes.
We are evolving. The Times and the Post and the Plain Dealer, just about every newspaper is evolving to be much more digital. We at the Times have crossed a sort of boundary where we are growing substantially online. Print still provides the bulk of our revenue, but we can sort of see a pathway to surviving online, and that is a result of a deep push in so many ways that are interesting and good for journalism. It's not just text journalism anymore. It's image driven, it's video driven, it's graphic driven. It's using social media in new ways. It's a new kind of journalism that opens new opportunities and new ways of storytelling that are all interesting and really quite valuable for the profession, and are also ways of drawing in a younger, more digitally oriented audience. I also think along the lines of what Betsy was saying, on the positive side, and this is really going to be my message to younger aspiring journalists, is that there are so many new kinds of journalistic ventures out there today. It's a very entrepreneurial world. We're probably, if the New York Times were to die, you couldn't recreate it. Probably, if the Cleveland Plain Dealer were to close, you couldn't recreate it. In fact, that was the message from the Denver Post. You shut it down, you can't start a new one. But there are sort of shoots of sort of emerging young entrepreneurial local and national journalistic ventures that are really quite exciting. And we have like some amazing work coming out of places like ProPublica, the Marshall Project, if you're familiar with these. There's environmental websites. There's a whole range of kind of very small, purely digital journalistic operations, some of which are nonprofit and they're financed by foundations or wealthy people, and they're hiring top-notch journalists and doing groundbreaking reporting. And that really is, I think, kind of the new pathway for aspiring journalists today, for the text or digital side, as opposed to the TV broadcast side that Chloe's going to talk about. So.
Okay, Chloe.
I'm happy to talk about that. I guess one of the advantages of television in this sort of newfound social media age is that television has always inherently been, writing and viewing for the ear and for the eye. So, everything that Jim had mentioned before about net news being about video and graphics and all of these things were also part of television and have been for a very, very long time. I think that has made the learning curve not as steep, and has really positioned television well in this new age. So that's been really incredible to see. One of the drawbacks, I think, was that the traditional or original line of thought was, everything that we put on television, we can just cut it, repackage it a little bit, and just post it on social media. That's not how social media works, and that's not how people my age are really consuming their news. So packages that are working on television aren't necessarily what is appropriate and what fits well. So even for people in my industry, it's been a lot of experimentation and trying to figure out what are the kinds of content people like to see. And so I guess
and how they like to see it also.
And how they like to see it. So Snapchat has been doing phenomenally well for NBC and NBC Universal. And recently our chairman actually just made a statement talking about how his broader vision is to really, really push in this digital age. So Snapchat is going really well. We have millions of unique visitors every day on our channel there. Going into other social media outlets, all of our reporters have great Twitter presences and everything else that you would need in this sort of climate. At the same time, I guess the challenge is, the so-called cord cutters, people my age don't really own televisions and aren't tuning in every night. And, that's not the same habit that our parents had. My parents always watched nightly news. And that's no longer really the case for people my age. And so I guess, there are pros and cons to that. Pros being there are new ways of experimenting and trying to figure out what's going to work, because I do believe that people still have a very active interest in what's going on in the world. The cons being you need a lot of money, it's true, to figure out and, to have that flexibility to experiment. I'm very lucky in that NBC Universal is just pretty successful. We have a lot of resources. We have great relationships with affiliates all over the country as well, which really feeds into our ability to be everywhere at the same time. And so now it's just a matter of figuring out what works. And I don't have the right answer to that. That's an interesting challenge that I'm looking forward to watching unfold.
And the second topic now then is, how did you get into the profession and what is the typical career path? So I guess, Betsy, you had sort of an atypical career, although you did come from a journalism family, I guess.
Well, the atypical thing there is that the typical path is that you work for your college newspaper. That gets you the internships. That's the typical path. And actually, it's still often the typical path. So yes, in my case, but I think that the atypical paths may now have become typical. Because, I think that expertise can, be a vector into, you start blogging on a topic, it gets people's attention. They want you, something about esports, nobody else does. Could you come and write about that for us? Because that's a big new area of interest. A lot of colleges in Ohio are now beginning to offer esports courses, esports teams. And so, that's just an example. I'm bringing this up because that's what my son blogs about. But at any rate, I do think that remains a vector, and it's an important one to consider because it is so, I don't know, the opportunities are tightening. If you have expertise in an area, there's an entrepreneurial opportunity for you.
Jim? It seems like there is no typical career path anymore.
Yeah, I don't think there is, and I think Betsy and I. Well, Betsy actually landed pretty early at her paper and stayed. My path of working for a little local newspaper, covering the school board and the local council, and writing 20 stories a week is not available anymore because local papers are shutting down. There just are not very many of those jobs, and that I think is terrible, not only for the local communities that lose their paper, but also those are great training grounds for people who want to learn how to report. And what I'm going to sound like an old fuddy-duddy now, but I do think a lot of young people entering the business think that they can simply get by because they can write a good English sentence. And that, of course, is hugely important, being able to, to be a skillful and elegant and poetic clear writer is all crucial for my business. The skills are obviously different for broadcast and graphic or other types of journalism. But people don't always know how to report. And if you don't know how to ask questions, if you don't have this sort of a special desire to go out and meet people and to dig into records or to challenge government officials and press conferences, all this stuff, this is a issue that journalism has to wrestle with. You can't learn that in journalism school, and you can't quite get it from rewriting copy for a blog. So I do think that there are, though, as I was saying earlier, these new journalistic ventures where they're coming up, into nonprofit operations, or they're working as digital reporters for big news organizations, and they're getting out and doing the reporting that way. I think those are all really good avenues into the business. I always tell people who want to be, who really want to be reporters, to be adventuresome and get out. Sometimes freelancing is a great way to go. I don't know if Betsy did this, but I've met any number of really fine reporters. Some of them, come to the New York Times, who just travel to places, sometimes war zones. I wouldn't advocate that necessarily, but they've gone overseas and they've reported freelance from Europe or Asia or Latin America and gotten real sort of experience. They've learned how to handle themselves in difficult situations. Those are really valuable skills for being a journalist. I'm sorry if I'm talking too long, but the other thing I would say is, because there are all these new avenues of journalism, there's graphic journalism, there's video journalism that, newspapers are using, which isn't just sort of television broadcast video, but sort of especially, shorter form newsy journalism the papers do through using video. There's podcasts. There's all these kind of really interesting, cool digital formats that involve basic reporting skills and journalistic judgments, which are all things people still have to learn. But the skills are different, and the storytelling approaches are different and interesting and quite exciting, actually. And so these are all also avenues where people are learning how to do podcasting in journalism school. They're learning it at local news stations, and then they're coming to work for the New York Times because we do podcasting now. Same thing with video journalism and graphic journalism, data-driven, data visualization type journalism, which is a whole another world that I can't even explain to you because I don't understand it. But I know the results are very often very powerful and really
Pictures
interesting.
worth 1,000 words.
Yeah, and that's an entirely different way of thinking about reporting. But it's all part of the same spirit of like getting at the truth and getting at the facts of on the ground. So those are all, even as newspapers are closing up, there are these new sprouts growing.
I have to jump in if I could just quickly, because I think that we don't want to overemphasize newspapers closing all over the place. I mean, here in the Cleveland area, we still have a lot of newspapers. We have the major daily, we're the largest news website in the state, but we have all the small towns around have their own papers. And then there are the weeklies that circulate in certain conglomerations of suburbs. They all have fairly robust operations, and they all hire young people to give them a foot up, so that I think that we shouldn't write off that as a possibility. And I personally think that kind of getting under the skin of a community is a very good way to get a sense of, how things work. And then the skill sets that you build, as I think we'll be getting into this, but as a journalist, writing on deadline and all those things. So I wouldn't discount that. Yeah. But the other thing here that you brought up, when I was traveling, I was on, an expense account my paper was sending me. These days, the small papers aren't able to do that. And I do think that has diminished the number of voices that we're hearing from on international affairs. And I think that's a significant loss. I have a cousin who was freelancing in Syria who was taken hostage. And of course, he had no big news media backing him up. It was, we got him out, but it was really, really scary. He was in prison for a long time. Yeah. So anyway, that's just a couple of observations there.
Chloe, I think you had more typical. You did freelance work before, even in college.
I did. So I guess in terms of learning reporting skills, I was very lucky because early on when I was in middle school and high school, I was able to be a pretty big part of our high school newspaper. And I had an excellent mentor. Actually, formerly a dean at Yale College of Morse, who ended up coming to my high school and becoming one of the deans there. And he had a great journalism background and was excellent in sort of teaching us the fundamentals. And those are something that I carry with me to this day. So I got my start in journalism pretty early on. As I got to college, I knew that I wanted to continue, but there were other things that I also wanted to do. So a cappella took up quite a bit of time, as anybody at Yale would probably know. And, you know, so my opportunities to continue doing journalism were my contributing a couple of op-eds to the Yale Daily News and also doing culture pieces for the Yale Daily News. But outside of that, I think that freelancing my senior year was probably one of the best things that I could have done for myself and for my career. I had basically cold called the features editor at Metro and said, here is my portfolio, most of which had actually consisted of academic work. I didn't have an official sort of background in journalism that I could show, like saying, hey, here are other articles for other papers that I've written. But, you know, I think that to the point that for newspapers, you know, yes, you need to know how to, they need to know that you can write well. Right. And it doesn't necessarily have to be for a newspaper or for a blog. It could also be for, in my case, academia. I loved the academic research papers I was writing. I thought it was worth putting up there just to get myself started. And so I did. So, you know, as soon as I think I started senior year, I used a website to just put up articles and put up anything that I thought was worth displaying, and then used that as sort of a jumping off point. And then freelancing, I think, A, gave me an understanding of how journalism in the real world was going to work outside of just, you know, high school or college newspapers. B, you know, gave me some sort of credibility, and C, gave me insight into what I wanted to do in the future. So I guess I did do sort of a more traditional path in that I did freelance and then I ended up where I am today. But I have a number of friends who pursued fellowships with other organizations like Reuters, like ProPublica, and a number of others who are giving funds to people my age to start their own paths.
That's great. That's great. Now the big question, which for me anyway, are the myths versus the realities. Clearly, I think in the past, journalism has sort of been romanticized as, you know, traveling around the world and going to these hot spots, or going to Washington, being a Watergate. But is that true? Is that happens every day, Jim, at the New York Times?
I don't know. I would always warn people to not think this is a glamorous business. It really is not. I think it probably is for some people. It certainly wasn't for me. And if anybody for anybody who's watched All the President's Men, you could, you know, it's an exciting, great depiction of these amazing reporters. But you also just see, like, they're just running around, you know, hitting the pavement and working really hard under unbelievably stressful conditions. And, you know, that's the life. You know, there's a lot of traveling to Hotel Sixes and on a moment's notice, and running out the door with just like a half-packed bag to get somewhere. And so it's not glamorous in that sense. I think for certain, like, you know, big name celebrity journalists, it gets pretty glamorous. It wasn't for me. What I would say is that if you like adventure and you're a curious person and you care about the truth and you're interested in talking to people, then it's the greatest profession. You go do your work with a great sense of mission, and that's kind of what makes it fulfilling. You're not going to get paid a lot. Most of us won't anyway. And you're going to work really hard and under really stressful conditions. But the end result is really, really exciting. And for those who, and if you like adventure, you can't beat it. I mean, if you get to the right place and the right news organization, you can do things like Betsy did and travel to important places on big stories, and that's really quite a high.
But Betsy, you were mentioning, though, your cousin. I mean, he went and was actually captured. I mean, that's a reality of life if you're going, I guess, to...
Right. I mean, the difference between when I was covering the Bosnian War and wars these days in terms of the risk factor, it's exponentially greater for everybody, even, whether you're a New York Times reporter or freelancer.
Yeah.
But, in Theo's case, he really, he speaks Arabic fluently with the Syrian accent. He knows the country, and yet he allowed his judgment to lapse because it seemed like a cheap way to get a guide, somebody offering to do it for free.
So is it, in the past, journalists have sort of been protected in war zones, would you say? And
well, not exactly. I mean, during the Bosnian War, the UN would fly you, if lots of freelance came into Sarajevo because you could fly in for free thanks to the UN, and several would get killed a week. I mean, they would be shot, they would hit a landmine. I mean, it was risky. Elizabeth Newfer, whom I knew in covering Bosnia for the Boston Globe, was killed just in a car accident covering Iraq. I mean, there are no guarantees. You're in a war zone, you can be killed. That's going to be true no matter what. But I do think that there's an extra element of risk now because there's an animus, sort of a price on the head of Americans, and they're. It's not that they're just simply in the wrong place. I was held by the Bosnian Serbs, but that's because they were angry at the Americans. They weren't planning to behead me, and in fact, they didn't really even hold me for more than 72 hours. So, I do think it's just a markedly different thing. Now, just to go back to the original question, the myths. I actually got into journalism thinking it was all going to be romance. My parents would talk about, the Foreign Correspondents Club, and, my father was in 4 different countries, went all over the world. That's what I thought. But it's exactly what Jim said. The really fun part of it is that you're never doing the same thing, even 2 hours in a row or 3 hours. It's really a great job for people who love to acquire lots of knowledge very quickly and distill it and convey it. Meet people, work in a team. A newsroom is, I think, the greatest concept that ever was. It's I find it very stimulating to be with people, lots of people who are all working on different things and having that kind of give and take. To me, it's still the greatest job. So,
okay. Chloe, what are the myths and realities with NBC?
I guess taking a peek at the next question, my answer will probably bleed into it a little bit. But I guess the biggest myth that ended up being debunked very, very quickly on my time there is, I guess I always had this vision that, reporters would go off, do their own thing and nail a big scoop, come back with an exclusive and, have sort of a parade of people celebrating what they were doing. And in reality, what I've found specifically at NBC is that all of our biggest stories are huge collaborative efforts across the organization. There's no one person who has an exclusive or has, an exclusive source and is the only person who can contribute meaningful and valuable information. If you take a look at any of our exclusives on our website, the number of contributors to any given article are always more than one. So I guess, when I think about the people who do well, it's the people who have a competitive drive and are hungry for stories and are hungry to, go out and talk to people, but they're also the ones who come back with information and valuable knowledge to share with everybody else. So I guess it's sort of more of a journalism I see is more of a team effort than perhaps I thought it was back when I was 16.
Right.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So is that the characteristic that journalists have to have nowadays? It has to be collaborative.
I think it always was, but in different. I mean, TV is a very collaborative operation, and in print journalism, very often you are alone. You're the one person out there, and you're finding your way somewhere, and you're writing a piece on your laptop and sending it. But that's not the bulk of what we do. So much of what we do is really collaborative. And Betsy's totally right. Newsrooms are these really fun, boisterous, kind of buzzing places full of people working together and sharing ideas and kind of pushing each other. And that is a really fun part of the job. I think sometimes forward correspondents, they've been alone for so long, they come back in the newsroom and they have kind of this deer in the headlight look where they have to sort of reacclimate to the newsroom. But for most of us who work in the newsroom, it's a really, fun and kind of really collaborative place.
Well, what types of people though tend not to do well then in the journalism business, would you say?
Well, I remember one editorial writer who came in and she could not work in a noisy environment. So we actually built her an office. And then she was okay. But to me, that she was losing half the fun. I also think, it isn't necessary. If you would like to make money, I don't necessarily think it's the right place for you unless you have this entrepreneurial strain, because the typical salary was never high, even in the heyday. My father used to say that he put me through Yale with his speaking fees. So, but actually, I don't think. All right, there are two other categories, because those would be the people who cannot work on deadline.
Yeah.
That you really have to be able to work fast. To this day, I'm still confused I have a few colleagues who just cannot work quickly, and how they lasted this long, I don't know, because you just have to be able to work really quickly. You have to be able to have an organized mind and kind of distill that information, know exactly what are the key things that need to go first and need to be emphasized, and you need to know how to write. And some people just don't, no matter how much they do write, it's just the words don't go, they don't flash, they don't sing. And you need, especially in this competitive, situation where you're competing for readers with all these alternative sites, you really have to be able to communicate those ideas in a compelling, beautiful way.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I would agree with the, if you can't deal with stress, you're not getting to this.
Yes, very true, very true.
Yeah.
Chloe, what about at NBC? What are the characteristics of a person who would not do well at in your office?
Someone who is not willing to sacrifice their time, I think are people who will not do well. I mean, I think that if you're looking for a very 9 to 5, get in, get out, this is not the career for you. I learned very early on, I've spent many, many days there for 12 to 14 hours when I didn't mean to. And you just have to be ready and willing to make that sacrifice.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's exciting, and it is hugely, it's been an amazing gift, but I also think that, you have to be willing to put aside some aspects of your social life. And if you're
no
not,
social life.
yeah. If you're not, then, find a different job.
You do want to commit to it. I think that's right. I think that's the right attitude.
Right.
I have also found that there's all kinds of people that succeed in the business, and you might think that they wouldn't. I've met any number of people. Maybe to me, I'm a good example of this. I'm basically a very shy person, and I've spent my entire life walking around, talking to people that were total strangers. And there's an amazing number of really shy people that end up being journalists. And there's people who are great with numbers and aren't particularly good writers, but they're great with documents and they're not very good writers and they become fantastic investigative reporters. There really are a lot of different personalities that can make it in the business. But it really comes down to, you kind of really have to love it. You have to really embrace it. It's what we do. It has to be sort of part of your
sort of
being.
A calling as opposed to
a
profession.
It is a little bit. Yeah, I think it is. And this is a little bit related to what we were saying about the kind of collective nature of newsrooms. But I really think that you have to have, it helps to be a flexible person, because you have to adapt to other people. You have to adapt to really difficult, stressful situations. You get thrown at things and you have to do them quickly. And if you're a very inflexible person, I think you're going to struggle with this business. It's not going to be quite right, because everything is like ad hoc-y in this business.
I would also add, you have to be a curious person.
You have to.
You have to want to answer those questions. It's the kind of thing that draws shy people to ask complete strangers all sorts of personal questions, or that, will cause you to sort of forget that you're in a war zone, but keep going because you want to know what's happening and you want to be able to tell that story. That curiosity, that wanting to know, is a big driver of a successful journalist, I think.
Yeah, totally.
And the last question is, if you don't stay in this profession, Chloe, you may not be thinking about this now, but before you retire, I mean, are there any exit strategies? Do you know of anyone who's decided journalism was not for them, and how did they leave? Where did they go?
I have many colleagues who went off into the blue horizon for other reasons. They wanted to make more money. They wanted the 9 to 5. There was a buyout. Staffs are being reduced, and they took it. They've ended up as lawyers. They've ended up starting their own political consulting firms. They've ended up doing PR for local institutions. They've moved on to other papers. As Jim indicated, that's the traditional trajectory anyway in journalism, that you just kind of hopscotch up to bigger and bigger papers. So that's one thing. Or we had a couple of reporters who were entrepreneurial, and they started something called the Med City News in Cleveland. That's still going. Essentially, this is a big medical center of medicine. When I moved here, it was a big center of auto manufacturing. Now it's medicine. And so they started an online only publication.
So some of them still stayed in journalism then?
Yes, exactly.
Not really. Okay.
Exactly.
But Jim,
Yeah, I mean, all of those things. I've known people who've gone to law school. A lot of people go into public relations. It's because it's a sort of a natural thing. Big public relation firms want somebody who understands where the press is coming from, and not only can write a press release, but also help sort of with the crisis management when the reporters are coming to their bosses. Political consulting, Hillary Clinton's top political pollster was a guy who was an Albany correspondent when I was there. Many of the people I've known at the Times have moved on to digital platforms. They've gone to places like Politico. They've gone to places like BuzzFeed, which really, really sort of improved and really professionalized its reporting. It breaks great stories all the time. A senior editor of the Times went to a place called Stat, which is the sort of medical healthcare online publication. It seems like it's doing very well. Okay. So there are, some have gone off to write books or teach. There's also
Have you seen anyone? Have you seen?
To my knowledge, not yet.
Not yet. Okay.
I do think that the skills that you learn in journalism are very translatable to any industry, though, because everybody wants someone who's able to communicate to people and someone who's able to write well.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I haven't thought that much about exit routes, but but I am confident that there are many, and people who have started in journalism can go on to do other great, amazing things as well.
Okay, so we now have time for questions. So if there are any here, Oscar, do you have any? By the way, if any, no, okay. If anyone online has questions, you can go to the Q&A at the bottom of your screen and type them in. I guess there aren't any at the moment. So what we all like to...
Is there anybody out there?
Yes, I think there are. What we all say, though, for these career panels is that you do have to do a self-assessment. You have to figure out your own personality and your own strengths and weaknesses and decide if you really are a good fit for this profession. So if you can't do it, for yourself, you can ask, close friends or family to help you. But that's the initial thing you should do, is do that, because otherwise you can end up in a place where you don't want to be.
I see the chat window.
Yeah, this seems like it seems like a couple of questions also.
Okay, what does this question say? I'm sorry, I can't read that. Oops.
Do you think that there are too many very short, quickly produced stories? Right.
It seems like
Lots of jobs ask people to write 5 stories a day from existing articles, etc.
Who would like to answer that one?
Well, I mean, I work in a digital newsroom. It is true that the average digital story is pretty brief, and we're putting things. It's 24/7 operation. Essentially, we're putting things up all the time. But this is where you have to have the senior level management has to be committed to journalistic excellence, to in-depth reporting, to deploying the resources and the personnel necessary to get the really big stories, and sort of seeing how when you start doing these short stories, sometimes that is in itself important because you begin to see patterns. So I know when I covered police, I was one of the early women reporters, and we haven't even talked about that. When I got in, there were very few women in the profession. I started writing about rapes, and I was, I guess, the first person to do that in Cleveland. I think that's important. So,
yeah.
Okay.
I mean, the one thing I would say to the questioner is, if someone is in a job like that, that you should look at it as a training ground of sorts, where that's not, obviously that's not where you want to spend your career doing that, but as a way to learn how to write really fast and how to write punchy and in a newsy style. I don't know if, in those jobs people are doing some reporting, but that can be a useful skill building experience if you're just getting the sort of essentials of very quick writing under stressful deadlines, and do it for a short while, and then move on to a better publication where you can spend more time doing the kind of reporting Betsy's talking about.
Okay, and this question, what is it? Do you think?
what sort of more unconventional summer jobs or activities would you recommend to college students who are interested in going into journalism? That is, jobs and opportunities aside from working for local papers.
Well, Chloe, you did high school. You were doing freelance, and
in high school, I was just writing for my high school newspaper. I started freelancing when I was a senior at university. Honestly, I think that there are a lot of people that I know started out their careers by starting their own blogs. And I think that is a fantastic way to just get into it. I actually hosted a panel of alumni from Yale who have also gotten into the journalism business. And one of the resonating takeaways that I think I got from hosting a Q&A with seasoned experts was very much, a lot of them said, when we're hiring, we don't care who you wrote for, we care about the content you produce. As long as we can see that you can write, it doesn't matter if it's attached to a big name or if it's something that you just did on your own. I know a couple other people who started weekly newsletters, and that was a sort of unconventional thing that they were doing just on their own time that ended up turning into a career and turning into something meaningful. So there are a lot of ways to just be a self-starter and get into it that aren't necessarily freelancing.
If you need to make money, then there's also the opportunity to work for a nonprofit in a writing capacity would be another option. Because often, you're still distilling information. Could be if it's a nature center, science center, technical information. That's good. There's actually quite a good market for technical science writing at this time.
And what is the Oh, there's another.
Okay.
Yeah, there was another question, like something about wanting to read reading recommendations. You had the
Oh,
Q-
yeah.
Oh, sorry.
What should I be reading for someone entering the field? Thanks.
I would recommend reading the local newspaper. Certainly reading the New York Times. I would recommend that.
The Cleveland Plain Dealer.
Absolutely. Cleveland.com if you're not in Cleveland.
There's so many. I think people should read what interests them in particular. If you're interested in criminal justice, you could go to the Marshall Project. If you're interested in healthcare, there's great blogs or stat websites that cover it. There's so much individualized, very sort of topical, theme-specific journalism out there today. It's worth tapping into that. I'd always recommend people read, the great magazines for long form. People should get a sense of what, the quality of long form reporting and writing is. Whether you're going to do it or not, it's just worth appreciating the skill and art form of it. Whether it's the New Yorker, obviously, the Atlantic magazine is fantastic.
Yeah, I think I spend an inordinate amount of my mornings reading. I mean, the New York Times actually has these wonderful newsletters, an opinion newsletter, sort of the kind of the interpreter newsletter, the political newsletter. We have some similar products, and then you can just. I mean, once you start showing an interest, you can sign up for these things. Your inbox will be flooded with this stuff, and it's just absolutely the best way to start the day with a full template of what's going on in the world, along with C-SPAN.
Is there a new one here now?
It's a follow-up question.
Oh.
We want to follow up.
Yeah, many things.
The type. What is this?
How can educators help cultivate an ability to recognize and appreciate excellent journalism?
All right.
From Sharon Kim.
Well, anyone?
Well, a lot of educators are former journalists. It's a surprising number. Well, I shouldn't say this because many of the people I know who teach in journalism are surprised by how robust the interest is in those programs.
Mm-hmm.
So many, our local Cleveland State has a journalism program. A number of the other universities have writing programs. I
find it interesting, though, that none of you went to Columbia Journalism School, or is that interesting? Did you ever consider it? Or?
I considered it. I was working at the Chinatown History Project, and I took night courses at NYU, but I didn't actually get a degree. I just took some courses. The dirty truth is like you can figure it out. But Columbia is a great school, and people who come out of there come out with amazing skills, and they get networked into like big news organizations. It's it's a fantastic program, but you don't have to go through it.
I spoke to a couple of classes at Columbia when I was in New York in recent years, and I was quite struck by, number one, how international their journalism student body is, very striking, and number two, how focused they are on telling the stories of the urban landscape using new digital means, which I think kind of makes it a more attractive option than maybe when I was considering it. And my mother went to Columbia Journalism School so that she would find a job after journalism school. But in my case, given the Watergate explosion, that wasn't necessarily guaranteed. So I went a different direction. But I do think, it can be a very stimulating way to learn new tools. On the other hand, it's still the case that most places, they'd like you to learn on their equipment and do it their way, and sort of learning by doing is always the best policy.
You know, and going back to the original question, which I don't think we quite answered, I mean, I think we've sort of talked, all three of us talked a little bit about the kind of characteristics we see in journalists that seem to be doing well around us. And really, people who ask questions are, you know, if I were going to say there was something I was going to identify in a young person that would make them stand out, is asking sharp, provocative questions and not being afraid to ask, you know, your elder. You know, it doesn't have to be in a snippety way, in a respectful way, but being willing to ask questions, being curious enough to ask questions, is a pretty good sign of a potential journalist, I think.
And you'd be surprised how many people, if you just cold call them or email them, or you maybe find somebody who knows them, and you just say, I'd like to shadow you for a day. I always say yes if I don't have a, you know, a bunch of sensitive meetings. Yeah. Well, we actually invite people into our editorial boards typically. And like I might have mentioned, we live streamed our gubernatorial endorsement interviews. So we're sort of more open than editorial boards.
Very open. We would not do that.
Well, I think we've reached our time, 5:30. So I'd like to thank all of our panelists, Betsy Sullivan in Cleveland, Chloe Zhang here in New York, and Jim Dow also in New York. And we hope that you found this panel informative and helpful. And if you would like to see it, it'll be posted on YaleCareerPanels.com in a few days, which is also the place where our previous panels have been posted. So thank you very much, everyone, and we'll see you at the next career panel.